Well, hello, church. It's another Sunday when we cannot meet together. But one of these days, the quarantine will end and we will be together again in worship, singing praises to God together. A lot of churches have noted that their live streaming services and those viewing the services after it's over with have had numbers greater than the number of people that were attending before all of this began. And I hope that that's a good sign for the spiritual condition of our world and our nation. I want to make an announcement before we begin the lesson today. One of the elders, at least one at any given moment, will be at the church building from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. today. That's Sunday. And those who wanted to drop off their contributions can. You can bring them inside. We will keep the numbers inside to the acceptable limits. Those of you who want to stay in your car and have someone come and get your donations, we can do that as well. But we will be there, someone will be there from 1 to 3. Our study today just happens to be the next in line of our series about the 7 I am sayings of Jesus. And interestingly enough, this one is his statement that he is the resurrection and the life. And for this, we're going to be reading in John chapter 11. And I'm going to be reading all the way from verse 1 to verse 44 because we want to get the entire context for our study today. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness will not end in death, for it is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to waken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go that we may die with him. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, The teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but still was in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, She fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. What a wonderful story. It didn't end there. There were some other things said about it later, but that's as far as we'll read today. You know, I got to thinking, there was not a funeral that Jesus went to or a place where someone had died that he visited where he failed to raise that person from the dead. Whether it was a little girl, whether it was a man who'd been dead for 4 days, whether it was a young man whose funeral procession was in progress when Jesus raised him from the dead, he always raised someone from the dead when he was in their presence. There were some interesting things about what was said in John chapter 11. When Jesus first heard this news, it is very possible that Lazarus was already dead. We're told in chapter 10 of John that Jesus had gone beyond the Jordan. So he had crossed over to the east side of the Jordan River, and from Bethany, that would have placed him at least 20 miles from where Lazarus and his sisters were. So we would probably consider that a day's journey on foot, and a very long day's journey at that. So it's very possible that not long after the messenger left to go find Jesus, Lazarus died. And when Jesus waited 2 more days before starting out on his journey, he probably did get there the 4th day after his death. The Jews had a practice of burying someone the very same day they died, almost immediately. If you read in Acts about the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira, you'll find that some young men carried Ananias out and buried him before his wife even knew about it. As a matter of fact, they had just got back in from burying Ananias when Sapphira died, and they took her out and buried her immediately as well. So it was a Jewish practice, and one that meant that Jesus knew of Lazarus's condition immediately when he heard the message, and probably before. But he waited, and he made the statement, this illness, the one that he'd been told about by the messenger, this illness is not going to end in death. Now, I want you to remember that, because that statement, I'm sure, confused his apostles. I'm sure it would confuse almost anyone. But Jesus was not speaking of avoiding death. He was speaking about the fact that for those who believe in him, death is never the end. There's another thing that I think we should note about this. Not only that Jesus makes a statement that death is not the end for us, and as it was not the end for Lazarus, we also need to note that sometimes we think that Jesus doesn't care when Jesus delays. That feeling was in the words of Martha and Mary. They both said the same thing at first. Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. That sounds a little bit like an accusation. That sounds a lot like sorrow and regret. Now, Martha is going to add something to that statement that Mary does not add. Martha's the one that when she invited Jesus to her house and Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet and listening to him, Martha was busy in the kitchen getting things ready, and she got a little bit angry that she was doing this alone. She got a little bit angry that Jesus let her do it alone. But it's Martha that comes out with the very strongest statement of faith of any person in John chapter 11. She said, even now I know God will give you whatever you ask. This statement, I believe, is a kind of a wishful thinking on her part. And I think that she believes at this point that Jesus would be able to raise Lazarus from the dead. If that's not the meaning, then I'm not sure what she meant by it. But it sounds like she believed that anything Jesus asked up to that would have been done by God. We also notice that when Jesus went to the tomb, he showed just how deeply he cared. He wept along with them. In a lot of times and cases, I've tried to put myself in the place of Jesus or in the place of someone in a Bible story. And I tried to place myself in Jesus's position here. You know, when you start out to go back to Bethany, that Lazarus is already dead. You know in your heart you're going to raise him from the dead. And when you get there and you see the people weeping, you know that their weeping is going to be turned into laughter. And I would probably have a hard time keeping a straight face. I would have a hard time keeping from smiling because I would be concentrating and focused on what I was about to do and the effect that that was going to have on the people around him, especially Mary and Martha. But Jesus doesn't do that. He focuses on how they are feeling right now. He sees their pain, and their pain becomes his pain, even though he knows what he's about to do. When he goes to the tomb, he has them roll away the stone. They protest because they know the nature of dead bodies. But he reminded them, didn't I tell you? If you believe. He had made a promise that whoever believed on him would never die. What an amazing promise. But I know that Lazarus and his sisters believed on him, and this must have confused Martha and Mary. But at any rate, he asks them to move away the stone. They move it away, and he cries out with a loud voice, commanding Lazarus to come forth. You know, I think, when you think about it, that it would be impossible for any created thing, anything created by God, to disobey God when God commands. Jesus, we're told, was the author of creation. John tells us in John chapter 1, there wasn't anything made that was made except he made it. So he made Lazarus. He gave Lazarus life. And so when he commanded the dead man to come out, it was impossible for even the dead to disobey a direct command from the Son of God. And Lazarus came forth. Jesus had said, I am the resurrection and the life. He didn't say, I bring resurrection and I give life. He said, I am resurrection. I am life. When we look at Acts chapter 2, the very first recorded gospel sermon, we find Peter saying something that's basically the heart of the gospel. It's going to be repeated in some shape or form or fashion several different times in different sermons, both by Peter as well as by Paul in the book of Acts. But as he's talking to the people on the day of Pentecost, he makes this statement. Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know, this man, delivered up by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. And God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. Death could not hang on to Jesus the Christ. It did not have the power because he is resurrection. He is life. And this heart of the gospel is a message that tells us basically three things. First of all, Peter talked about what Jesus did. He recounted his great deeds and his miracles. Secondly, he pointed out what man did. Man crucified him. Man sinned. And there's not a one of us that can say we are without sin. There's not a single one of us that could even say, if we had been there, we would not have consented to his death. We would not have cried out, crucify him. We would have done something to try to stop it. I don't think any of us could say that. The bravest of his apostles didn't do it, and they couldn't. It's a weakness of mankind. And then there's a third thing that's included in this gospel, and that is what God did. God worked in Jesus. God raised him from the dead. And when we think about the time of resurrection, when Jesus himself was raised from the dead, I kind of think about our situation today where we cannot gather together. There are no great crowds going to be in this area of the state, in this area of the country, because people are trying to keep their distance or trying to get control over a disease. And we feel badly that there's not going to be a big crowd on Easter Sunday. But I want to remind you, there was not a big crowd on the Sunday when Jesus was raised from the dead. Beside the angels, the only ones present when Jesus was raised from the dead were the guards who were guarding his tomb, trying to make sure that nobody came and stole the body. Imagine what it was like when the stone was rolled away and he came out. We're told that they became like dead men, frightened to death. There were some women that were on their way to the tomb, and they were worried. Who's going to roll away the stone for us when we go? Because they were going to try to prepare the body of Jesus for his burial. Either they did not know Joseph and Nicodemus already done it, or they wanted to do it themselves. But at any rate, they discussed among themselves, worried, who's going to roll away the stone? And they got there, and it was already rolled away, and he was already gone. So they got there too late to see him. Others came too late to see him. Some saw an angel, some saw two angels inside the tomb. And finally, Mary Magdalene spoke with Jesus, thought he was someone else. But at the time of the resurrection of Jesus, he was pretty much alone. So don't feel so badly that this Sunday, the church buildings are empty. Be thankful that the tomb of Jesus was empty on that day. Jesus had said those who believe on him will never die. Believing on Jesus means more than just mentally assenting to that belief. Believing on him means acting on that belief. That Jesus will tell the Pharisees and the Sadducees that they were condemned because they didn't believe the teaching of John the Baptist. And the writer in the book of John said that the reason he knew they did not believe him is because they refused to be baptized by him. It takes more than just belief, it takes acting on that belief. But you and I are faced with a choice in this world, and most of you watching this have already made your decision and your choice. You chose Jesus the Christ. On the day that Jesus was on trial, Pontius Pilate offered the crowd a choice. Now, the New International Version reads a little bit differently than the other translations. And as a student of Greek and Hebrew, I've always wondered why one writer varies and is different from another. And I looked into this and found out that the NIV probably got this right because in it, in Matthew 27, verse 11, Pilate makes them an offer of two people, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ. Most of the writers drop the first Jesus and just call him Barabbas. And the reason is understandable. You might say, well, this person's a robber, this person is an insurrectionist, he is a murderer. So it's not fitting to even call him Jesus. He doesn't deserve the name Jesus. But in reality, when we look at the oldest manuscripts, they were probably right. His first name probably was Jesus, Jesus Barabbas. So Pilate offered the crowd one of two Jesuses. And which one would they choose? They chose Barabbas. And a lot of people make a similar choice today. They choose to believe in the Savior of the world. They believe in choosing riches, comfort, pleasure, the easy road, the road that does not cause them to be ridiculed or made fun of. But many of us have chosen Jesus the Christ and everything that means by choosing him. When we chose him, we chose the hard way. We chose a way that may include persecution, that will involve a lot of sacrifice. But if you chose Jesus Christ, you chose rightly, because you chose the man that death could not hold. And that one Sunday morning, early in the day, an angel came and rolled away the stone, and he came out, and he will never die again. And he promises the same kind of ending for us when he told his disciples that the illness of Lazarus was not going to end in death. He could also be talking to us. No matter what happens to us, it doesn't end in death, because he is the resurrection and the life, and we believe in him. Thank you. May God bless you and your family and keep you safe.